very happy to welcome you today to talk about multilateralism at the Paris Peace Forum. I'm Mariana Lozada. I'm Sciences Po representative here in Southeast Asia. I'm based in the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, and I work for the cooperation between Sciences Po and the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. So I'm very happy to chair this event, organized jointly by Sciences Po and the Lee Kuan Yew School with the support of the French Embassy in Singapore and also with the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy and the USPC and US grant. I would particularly like to thank His Excellency Marc Avansour, Ambassador of France of Singapore, Ariane Tréchamp, who is the Deputy Head of Mission, Professor Danny Kuan, who is the Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, also the events team that were wonderful helping us putting together this event and for hosting the event. The Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy and Sciences Po have launched a joint dual degree program that is a master degree in public policy and a master degree in European affairs. The first students are starting next month in Paris. So I thought this event will be a wonderful occasion to organize a first event because Sciences Po is a founding member of the Paris Peace Forum. Our Vice President for International Relations, Vanessa Schor, is the Vice President of the Paris Peace Forum. This is a good opportunity to launch an event and also to launch this program. I will now introduce our distinguished speakers. Dr. Justin Weiss is the Director General of the Paris Peace Forum, which is an annual event that was launched last year under the impetus of French President Emmanuel Macron. Dr. Weiss is an historian of the US. He taught at various institutions, including Sciences Po, and he's also a Sciences Po alumnus. He served as Director of Policy Planning at the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs for 6 years, and he was also Senior Fellow in Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institutions in Washington, D.C. He's the author of numerous books on the United States. Mr. Yong Si-King is Assistant Chief Executive of the IMBA, Infocom Media Development Authority of Singapore, and also Deputy Commissioner of the Personal Data Protection Commission, PDPC. Si-King is a lawyer by training, and he now oversees IMBA, AI, and data industry development strategy. He's responsible for developing a forward-thinking government on AI and data, promoting industry adoption of AI and data analytics, and building AI and data science capabilities in Singapore. Si-King also oversees the enforcement of Singapore's Personal Data Protection Act 2012, which implies managing and implementing policies related to the protection of personal data. Last but not least, Professor Danny Kuan is the Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy and Lee Ka-shing Professor in Economics here at the school. His current research takes on economic approach to world order with a focus on global power shift and the rise of the East and alternative models of global power relations. He was previously Assistant Professor of Economics at MIT, Professor of Economics and International Development, and Director of the Socio-Hoc Southeast Asian Center at the London School of Economics. He also served as LSE Head of Department for Economics and Council Member of Malaysia's National Economic Advisory Council. Without further ado, because we have a very short time for many speakers and a very dense session, I will now give the floor to His Excellency Marc Avansour, Ambassador of France to Singapore, for his opening remarks.
Well, good evening to all, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very pleased being here today, and I wanted to express, my to be how grateful I am, to Professor Danny Kuan Dean of the School of Public Policy, and also to Mariana Lozada for hosting, such an event. Actually, it's my second time here at the Liquid School of Public Policy to discuss about the Paris Peace Forum, to discuss about a multilateral system and global governance. And last time it was, I think, last year in November, so a few weeks after the first edition of the Paris Peace Forum, and we had, such an event with Ambassador Tomiko, that most of you, are very familiar with, and also with Mr. Hassan Razouk, who was actually presenting a project within the framework of the Paris Peace Forum. It was a project on the blockchain and renewable energy. And with us, there was also Professor Yeo Lewi, the director for the European Union Center here in Singapore. And this time, we feel very privileged, to have Justin Weiss with us, because Justin is the founder and the Director General of the Paris Peace Forum, and so it would be the opportunity, for him to share with all of us about the coming second edition of the Paris Peace Forum and the key priorities of this important event. Let me just try to seize this opportunity, to emphasize that I think that France and Singapore, and France and ASEAN, have a shared commitment to a multilateral system. We are convinced that the multilateral system currently is under threat, that you have a competition among great powers. Some are trying to build a sphere of influence, and that we should take that into consideration to see not only how to safeguard the multilateral system, but also to reform it, to make it more relevant and therefore more useful. I think it is the case between France and Singapore on many areas. Of course, trade and the signing of the FTA recently between EU and Singapore is a good illustration of that. As you know, we expect it to enter into force by the end of this year. It's also the case on security and defense. You may have noted, that we have also this shared commitment on the law of the sea, of freedom of navigation, freedom of flight. It was also very well illustrated by the deployment of the French carrier task force during coinciding with the Shangri-La dialogue this year and cruising through the South China Sea, which is a way to reaffirm our commitment to freedom of navigation in that region as everywhere else in the world. I would say that it is also the case on climate change, and Singapore played a leading role for the success of the COP21 and the successful conclusion of the Paris Agreement, and also on connectivity, digital connectivity. And let me just mention one important collaboration that we have between France and Singapore, which is the evidence of that. It's the roadmap on digital innovation, governance of the internet and cybersecurity, which was adopted during PM Lee Hsien-loong's visit to France as guest of honor of President Macron last July, a year ago. And since then, we have made progress. Let me just mention one of it, which is the Paris Call on trust and security in the cyberspace, which was a call adopted during the first edition of the Paris Peace Forum. And a few months afterwards, Singapore made the decision to join this call. And I think Justin can elaborate further on this, but it's a call which associates not only government, but also companies, representative of civic society. So also this new model of a multilateral approach. Lastly, just to mention that we are very pleased that this year another project from Singapore has been selected to participate to the Paris Peace Forum, which is a project developed by PDPC, and I'm very pleased that Mr. Yong Zekin can introduce it and present it to you, which is a project on a human-centric approach on AI. And so I will conclude by saying that AI is a shared priority between our two governments, that we have signed during PM's visit to France an MOU on AI, involving the key research organization in France, CNRS, but not only, INSERM, the healthcare research organization, and also INRIA, science computing research organization. And we will have this coming August, a second workshop on AI and health. So clearly, there is this priority, and I think it's perfectly in line with what we try to develop at a bilateral level, to have also this showcase of what we have done together during the coming Paris Peace Forum. Thank you very much.
Thank you, His Excellency. I would now give the floor to Dr. Justin Weiss, who will speak on the current state of multilateralism, its challenges. More states are looking inward. The world is not going in the right direction. So I guess the Paris Peace Forum will try to find some solutions about it. Dr. Weiss, please.
Thank you very much, Marina. And of course, it's a pleasure to be here, especially in light of the cooperation with Sciences Po, which, as you mentioned, is one of our founding members. We have 8 organizations from places like India, Mexico, Germany, and France that are founding organizations of the Paris Peace Forum, and among them is one academic institution, Sciences Po, and so it's there's another reason to be here. So I'll be brief, but I'd like to just give you the rationale behind the forum, and the rationale really starts with the fact that we have more and more global problems, but there are still 193 countries. So that's the very beginning of any reflection on global governance. And what we do at the Paris Peace Forum is we push it a bit further. There are 193 countries, and that's true for issues like proliferation or trade, which are still pretty Westphalian. But for many issues, states are not enough, and you need other actors. You need international organizations, of course, assemblies of states, but also local governments, companies, the corporate sector, foundations, NGOs, trade union, experts, religious groups, etc. And so it takes all of these stakeholders to make global governance or a global village, and that's the sort of the beginning of the reflection we conducted on the Paris Peace Forum. But let me back up a bit. When I started with discussions with President Macron in the summer of 2017, we had an assessment that the international system indeed was not going in the right direction. And wherever you looked, the picture was pretty bleak. It's not just tensions among great powers, it's also the fact that on the major issues confronting us today as a planet, we were doing badly. We're losing the war against climate change. We are losing the war against pandemics. We'll have more victims in the future than we had in the past. We're not doing so good on development. The internet is a mess. Cybersecurity is in the state that you know well. And so, the list goes on. I'm not saying that everything is going down the drain, but that at least on the major issues that confront countries beyond borders, we're not doing so well. And at the same time as we have these more and more and very concrete global challenges, we have less capability to deal with them because of great power tensions, because of populism in the West, because of the complexity of these issues. And so that's how the idea was born, that we have every year 1, 2, or 3 important events devoted to the economy, from Davos to Boao Forum, etc. We have several devoted to security, from the Shangri-La Dialogue here to Munich and Manama Dialogue and others. But there is no moment on the agenda of leaders and public opinions devoted to collective action and to what we actually need to do together, simply because Singapore by itself, France by itself, or the US by itself cannot solve either biodiversity or challenges or climate change or fiscal evasion or migration or internet governance, all of these issues that are very concrete for people. Let me also say a word, because the title we chose included globalization. And so what's the relationship between globalization and global governance in a sense? Remember the 1990s when we were all thinking that the world was flat, well, some of us were thinking that the world was flat, by the title of a famous book by Tom Friedman, that is to say, globalization and the advances in technology, of communication, and airlines, etc., had flattened competition in a sense, and also that history was, if not something of the past, that at least the horizon, the political horizon, was liberal democracy, as Frank Fukuyama was arguing, and there was a great enthusiasm around globalization and the idea that we could make progress on route to a pacified polity in the world and something more which would bring both growth and peace. Going along with this enthusiasm was a sort of overdrive or overreach of initiatives trying to, by the West in particular, trying to launch new treaties, new norms, etc. And for Europeans, the idea that the European model, the EU, was the horizon, that we would at some point go beyond sovereignty and share sovereignty in order to get to better governance. And so that was the 1990s. We also thought that global governance could be improved, that we would have a World Trade Organization, this one was created, that we would have also a pillar that would be on investment, that would have a governance of investment, and that we would sort of complete the architecture of global governance with traditional multilateral institutions. Well, it didn't turn out so well. That is to say, globalization brought many good things, starting with the lifting out of poverty of millions, or actually hundreds of millions of people, not only in China, also elsewhere, thanks to the growth that it helped, didn't create by itself, but helped, and also by the exchanges that it sustained. And so it created wealth within countries and among countries. However, it also, with time, and it also provided, of course, the emergence of new countries, of new powers, especially during the 2000 and the decade that followed. But it also created antibodies. And these antibodies were, I would say, energized by various events, by the Iraq War of 2003, by some geopolitical shocks, by the economic crisis of 2008, and then in the decade that followed, and that is finishing next year, we discovered these antibodies, and they started working against that framework of global governance. One is the fact that in the West, of course, there had been an enrichment phenomenon, but also a very poor repartition of that enrichment. You're probably all familiar with the elephant curve by Branko Milanovic, and the sort of illustration of the fact that middle classes in the West didn't benefit from globalization as much as the lower and middle classes from other countries. And so they started to think that, after all, globalization was not so good, and also that globalization had brought all sorts of cultural and political effects with it that they didn't find so palatable, and that basically the havoc and the chaos that it brought was not so good. And so the populist wave that started in the mid-2010s in the West is one of the reasons why global governance is more difficult today. A second thing that happened was enrichment of countries and the emergence of new powers. And what happened here was that whereas you had the US as clearly a dominant power after the Cold War in the 1990s, then conditions started to equalize, to paraphrase Tocqueville. That is to say, you saw the emergence of these countries, and indeed the repartition of power in the international system started to change. And of course, going towards some form of multipolarity, whether it's perfect multipolarity or multipolarity in some fields, but not others, can be debated. But the fact is the margin of superiority that was that of the US began to decline. And so the question that we had on our hands was, can we still have multilateralism and the conciliation of interest, etc., and the respect for rules, etc., in a situation of multipolarity? Whereas until recently, multilateralism had been supported by an underlying situation of either bipolarity in the Cold War or sort of unipolarity in the 1990s and after. So the question was, and that is before us, is can we have some sort of multilateralism even when it's no longer one dominant power that is sort of ordering the system. So that was I would say the second antibody of globalization, and we saw how it played, especially in the multilateral institutions that have been created after World War II, reflecting a certain repartition of power, and of course the contestation by countries from the global south that, and they had a point that these institutions had been created at a moment when, of course, their influence was not very large, and they had grown in influence, and that contributed in turn to the problems of global governance. So where does the Paris Peace Forum get into this picture? Well, first of all, I think there was a consensus in 2018, and among all the heads of state that were present. We didn't have President Trump because he doesn't fancy multilateralism, but we had many others, and pretty much the rest of the world, to be frank, from Asia, from Russia, from Latin America, and other continents. To reaffirm the importance of rules-based order and the importance of multilateralism and collective action, because it's the imperfect but best method we've found to deal with these global challenges. The second thing is that we know that today, in the current geopolitical context, if multilateral institutions were to disappear, if WTO exploded or the UN disappeared or anything, we would not be in a position to recreate them and to adopt the texts, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that were adopted after the war, because there would not be a consensus among the 193 countries of the UN to do so. So the idea was that these multilateral institutions that are imperfect, sometimes ineffective, certainly inefficient many times, not always, but many times, should be supported, should be defended, and the principle of multilateralism reaffirmed. The second idea was that the Paris Peace Forum should also, because it includes organizations from the global south, should also push for the reform of multilateral institutions to make them more resembling to the current phase of the international system, because in the longer term, that's a condition for their legitimacy and their success. And the third thing is probably more original. The third objective, if you like, of the forum, and I'll finish with that. It is the idea that, of course, we can see the glass half empty, and that's all the difficulty, the hurdles that multilateralism is now undergoing, and the difficulties it has to actually produce positive effects and outcomes. But we could also see the glass half full. And while traveling around the world to mobilize people for the forum, I found many energies, many forces that actually wanted to go beyond borders and create and find solutions, push forward projects, initiatives that were answers to these global challenges that we know we need the others in order to solve. And also the idea that multilateralism, if we cannot recreate the perfect multilateralism of yesterday, basically multilateralism in our mind is, Westphalian among states. It's universal, it's institutional, and it's legally binding. But when you look at it closely, whether it's economic governance or whether it's governance of sports or governance of health and other aspects, you have lots of initiatives, of multilateral initiatives that don't conform to this definition of multilateralism. So Mark mentioned the Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace. It's a good example, or COP21 is a good example. So they're not necessarily Westphalian. Generally, they associate these forums, these treaty, or not treaties, precisely these texts or these calls, they associate states with non-state actors. So the Paris Call, for example, is 66 governments plus 400 companies and civil society groups. They're so not necessarily Westphalian, they're not necessarily universal, they're more coalition of the willing. In order to put pressure on the non-signatories of these, they are not institutional in the sense that you don't have a bunch of civil servants sitting in Geneva or New York or elsewhere doing this, and they're not legally binding. See COP21, for example. COP21 rests largely on incentives and incentive mechanisms. So of course we could say that's not good enough and you won't get enough effect out of these. But the truth is, first of all, that's the best we can get until we get a UN treaty legally binding on cybersecurity or climate, etc. At least this is a normative progress that we're making. And second, the difference is precisely that it associates the right people. You cannot talk about health without having the Gates Foundation around the table and many others. You cannot talk about development without having many actors, the development banks, the Aga Khan Development Network, and many others, etc. And so this new form of multilateralism, sort of bottom-up multilateralism, certainly can help and can also work hand in hand with traditional multilateralism. A good example is the Paris Call on cybersecurity, which now is feeding into the UN process of the group of governmental experts at the UN has been formed on cybersecurity, and it's using that text to sort of fuel its or to feed its processes. So I'll stop here, but you get the idea. What we want to put forward at the Paris Peace Forum is this sort of complement to traditional multilateralism and to basically try to organize the planet better by putting the right stakeholders around the table and put forward projects such as that my neighbor.
So maybe Professor Danbois, you could comment on this question of the inefficiency of traditional multilateralism, new ways of helping to address these challenges, and maybe from the approach of the global economic governance.
Thank you, Mariana. Thank you, Your Excellency, Mariana, for putting together this event. Thank you, Justin, for coming all the way here to Singapore and presenting such a vivid, wonderful vision of a world that we must continue to strive towards. I thought that I would, in responding to Justin's remarks, make 2 points. The first is, what a wonderful solution, what a badly needed solution the Paris Peace Forum now presents for us to a range of global problems. So I want to elaborate a little bit on that first point. My second point is to raise some questions about the challenges that the forum will face and to ask how the forum intends to address these challenges. The world that we are describing here has been characterized for you in words with many syllables: multilateralism, rules-based order, globalization. We recognize these words, but I think sometimes, especially here in Singapore, so distant from the transatlantic conversation on multilateralism, we might forget why these things matter. And so I always keep reminding myself, in Singapore, for every dollar in value that we and the people around us generate, 4 times that, $4 gets traded across Singapore's national boundaries. For Singapore, trade exchange with the rest of the world is a critical fulcrum by which Singapore continues to add value, create wealth, create opportunities for its people. We wouldn't be able to grow if we didn't have the opportunities afforded us by globalization. So I constantly have to remind myself that. The other thing I think sometimes we have to remind ourselves is how in Singapore, we are a small nation. There's no getting around that we are 5 million people on a piece of land, 720 square kilometers in total. And the world is populated by big beasts. The world, the international community of nations, all nations seek to advance their own self-interest. What is it that keeps us safe and relevant? What allows us to deal with the big beasts of the international community? Well, what Justin's referring to, the rules-based multilateral order, the implicit agreement that all nation states in the international community have come together and agreed to follow, to abide. The rules of adjudication. In prosaic terms, the school teacher in the playground that we as small school children wander into and learn to get along with the bigger kids. It is the school teacher, the multilateral rules-based order that's allowed us to do all this. So, when Justin refers to the big beasts around the world undermining multilateralism, undermining the rules-based order, being suspicious of globalization and seeking to roll it back, it is an existential challenge for Singapore and all nation states that have benefited from the multilateral rules-based order. So we forget that in the past, Singapore did not have high incomes that we could apply our industry to, and therefore leverage economies of scale, learning by doing, to then allow our productivity to rise. And it's this open, rules-based system that's allowed Singapore, and indeed China as well, and before it, the United States, to benefit from engaging with the international community of nations. This is a wonderful thing that the world has invented, and it is now at risk. It is now challenged by some of the very same architects that have put it together. So that we've got a Paris Peace Forum standing up, putting its hand up and saying, you know what, if the big beasts are no longer going to be doing this, we, the other members of the international community, need to take on this job. France, Singapore, and all other like-minded nations need to come together in this critical moment. So I think it's such a wonderful idea. What are the challenges involved in this? Okay. One of the things that multilateralism rules-based order does is it provides global public goods. It provides the rules-based system that all nations by themselves would not, through selfish reasons, put up. It solves the challenges posed us by transboundary problems, international financial panic, global epidemics, spillover in economic policy. All of these things, if not taken care of, lead the world to, again, a might makes right kind of international community. All of these problems lead to what in economics is known as a free riding problem. We in Singapore will let some other part of the world maintain the rules-based order. It's expensive, yeah, so we don't need to spend our money on it because we'll let Paris Peace Forum fix it and then we'll benefit from it. There's a free-riding nature to the provision of these global public goods. So that we've got a Paris Peace Forum spearheading the work for us does not mean we, the rest of the world, can just sit back and just admire the elegance of the problem. We need to pitch in and help. This is why we've come together. Paris Peace Forum, Singapore's policymakers, scholars everywhere to try and make this thing happen. But embedded in the very problems that the Paris Peace Forum tries to solve are also the existential challenges for it. So I've used up a lot of my time talking about what a wonderful thing it is, and I think that's fine because I do want to emphasize the positive part. But in closing, I want to mention some of the negative issues surrounding it, some of the challenges surrounding it. Why is it that something that's so beneficial to the world, the multilateral, rules-based, globalized order, now at risk? It's now at risk for all the reasons that I've already mentioned, plus some new ones. Free riding is a problem. Letting global public goods challenges be solved by others, not properly recognizing that this is something we all need to pitch in, and then sometimes disagreeing with the outcomes. So here are some examples. America, after building the international rules-based world trading system, thought that after the last 50 years, its economy was being shortchanged by the very system that it built. Its people saw rising income inequality, the vanishing of economic opportunity for its low and middle income classes. It saw a hollowing out of its industrial landscape. It saw what it thought to be the outsourcing of jobs to foreign lands and the displacement in its own cultural domain of foreigners. It looked at that and it thought, this is what globalization and the multilateral rules-based order has brought. And its people saw no recourse because it had constructed a narrative of the elites in the United States viewing the poor and the middle-income classes who are suffering from these changes in the economic environment. It viewed the elites as having left them, having distanced themselves from them. If anything, viewing them with contempt or at best indifference. The United Kingdom, also an architect of the rules-based order, when it came to asking the people, did it want to continue being part of the wonderful regional journey that is the European Union, its people voted to Brexit because it too saw the vanishing of its own culture. And here's the problem. None of the elites in the world were able to explain to these people why they needed to hang on. The challenge, it seems to me, for the Paris Peace Forum is what is the new narrative that it now has to tell the Americans who feel left behind, the Brexiteers who no longer want to be part of this globalized enterprise, and indeed coming challenges from all those who want to seek to free ride the multilateral system and impending disagreements between the United States and China simply being the tip of the iceberg. That as globalization and evolution of the multilateral rules-based system proceeds, more and more we will see disagreement, free riding, and continued disruption. I have complete confidence that the conversations that we're going to be building with the Paris Peace Forum will address these challenges. But this construction of the new narrative is something we urgently need to do, because otherwise the disenchantment will continue and the global system will continue to fracture.
So it was very interesting to know how Singapore and countries like Singapore benefit from multilateralism, but it's also a challenge. That leads me to our third speaker in a kind of similar situation. You presented a project on the governance of AI. Well, we've been hearing about AI for the past years. It's a great opportunity for humanity because it will bring a lot of new opportunities, efficiency, will make us more competent and so on, but it also poses a lot of challenges. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about the project that you presented to the forum and what are the economic implications of AI for Singapore.
Thank you for this opportunity to come and share a bit about what we've been doing in Fucong Media Development Authority and the Personal Data Protection Commission. Hearing the speakers who come before me talk about multilateralism made me actually think a bit about why we started on this project and how we ended up hosting this project in the Paris Peace Forum. And I hope that at the time that I am through with my presentation, I'll be able to bring home some of the very real impact that it will have in our pockets. And that's where I'll start, right? We all, I'm sure, have a smartphone in our pocket. I'm sure all, if not most of us, right, came here at least using a mapping function to find out where this place is. Some of us required it for giving us navigation if we drove, some suggestions on which MRT line to take, where to get off, what buses to connect. It's all powered by AI, right? Some of us like to speak to our phones, not because we are making a phone call, but because sometimes it's called Siri, sometimes it's called Hello, OK Google, right? We do that, right? That is again a function powered by AI. It brings up two things. It touches our lives. And second, these devices are already with us, and they're just one very tangible example of how AI has touched our lives. But behind it, how does this technology work? Two things I want to point out. Data, right, is fundamental to how AI features now work so well, right? And second, these features are universal. That same phone operates when we're here. When we travel on holiday, it operates whichever country we're in, right? And we come to assume and expect that, right? Again, that's just one example. So, these benefits are actually built on top of a lot of the rules-based system that we've just spoken about. And many of us actually don't touch that in our daily lives, right? We don't touch that and we don't see that, but it's built on top of that. So for AI, I'll share a bit about the national strategy, right? It's an industry strategy that we've adopted. If we've lived in Singapore for the last 2-3 years, we could not have escaped the discussion about the future of our economy, the industry transformation maps, right? The sector transformation maps, the industry digitalization plans that we've all talked about, we read about in the news, and some of us have been engaged in, right? It's a concerted effort to transform our economy into a digital economy. And by nature, once our business is digital, it is by definition and by default global, because it allows us to reach a global audience. How does it impact our lives? Well, putting aside the plans to bring AI into our sectors, into our companies, what have we done, right? Well, what are the key features when you want to transform the industry? One, you need to be able to support companies, businesses, right? Some of us own companies, many of us work for companies. We go to work, we build things, right? We build applications, we build devices, and it is for a global market. It has to work both in Singapore, in the neighboring countries that we test it and sell it to, right? And it is exported overseas. The need for technical standards, right? The need for skills, right? The ability to work with these things and to be able to bring our skills so that as individuals we can work here, we work in another country, we still do the same thing, right? All these, right, are actually fundamental to building the digital economy, right? And it's also fundamental to these are things that we appreciate, but again built on top of the rule-based global system that we just heard about. So for our AI strategy, we support industry development, we support training through different programs, training the IT profession to be able to work with AI, training individuals so that we are familiar with and are prepared to use some of these tools. We support companies who are developing these tools through common applications, common libraries like the National Speech Corpus, our intelligence sensing library that we put out. And then we also support research, right, and translation of research into industry through our AI Singapore efforts. So that's part of the AI strategy. But key to all this, right, and how and where our work grew out of is really, if we cannot speak about adoption of AI by companies using AI in the workplace without building consumer confidence and trust in AI, because that's ultimately the key to success, right? So how do we build consumer confidence and trust in AI? And that's where we put together a plan, right? A strategy to boost confidence and trust. It has three components, right? And it is designed to on a national level, bring together different stakeholders to have a proper conversation. And now we are at a stage where we are hoping that what we try to do at a national level by bringing together stakeholders, we can replicate on a global level by taking part in forums where these conversations can happen across countries as well. So what do? We have an AI advisory council. We bring together technology companies that are providing the technology and they give us a direction of where the technology is headed. We bring together companies that want to make use of AI to transform their businesses. We bring together representatives who can speak up for consumer concerns and consumer interests, right? And it is in a conversation with these three types of stakeholders that we can get a good sensing of, one, where technology is headed, the level that consumers are prepared to make use of this technology, so that companies, when they are calibrating and designing features, will do so sensitive to what consumers want. And in that sense, that we will create what we refer to as a reinforcing feedback loop. The consumers will use those features. The features are introduced at a level that will move ahead incrementally, right? And as a result of this, we are moving in the same direction progressively. Now, of course, you just can't put 12 persons in a room and expect work to be done, right? They need to be plugged into larger conversation. So how do we have that larger conversation? Again, along these three tracks. One, AI for industry. Second, AI for society. And then third, AI and research. For AI and industry, what we've done is we've developed a governance framework around the use of data, the ethics of decision making, the right way to govern those, so that provides us that structure for conversations with companies about responsible use of data, responsible decisions around designing products, responsible decisions around training and monitoring of models, AI models, and communication and transparency with consumers. A constructive conversation so that we guide companies to build it the right way. For society, we need to ensure that our level of savviness with this technology increases. Many of us in this room moved from the old days where we didn't have the internet to the internet, right? And all of us who made that transition had to figure out how to do keyword searches, Boolean searches, right? In those early days, or, right? We had to struggle and we learned that. We picked up a skill, our level of savviness increased, we found our way around the internet. That's the same kind of thing the same kind of mission we need to now have when it comes to new technology like AI. How do we understand that AI isn't a genie that you let out of a bottle and it goes and does things that you don't and cannot control? You can control. But we need to be educated and we need to be comfortable with that. So we need to have a conversation. How do we have a conversation? It is through training programs like, for most of us, AI for everyone, AI for industry, which is targeted at consumers and at workers in our place, right? For some of us who are retired, for some of our children who are in school, we have digital readiness program to reach out and talk and prepare them so that as consumers and as workers, we are comfortable and ready to use. So that's important. And of course, the third one is AI and research. We know that AI is coming. We know that it will affect different types of legal, regulatory, and policy issues. But we can't, what we can do is we can anticipate and prepare. So how do we do that? With a research center set up in the National University of Singapore Law School. And what we try to do is match research talent with industry players, with public agencies, identify and anticipate possible problems, create possible solutions, so that when the problem that we anticipate arises, we are not scrambling for the first version of the answer, we have something to work from. But more importantly, by doing that, we would have identified a group of industry experts that we can also call on and tap on to solve those problems. So that's what we need to do, what we put together as a framework to build AI that is centered around the consumer and builds around creating trust. Fundamental to this is of course data, right? And I began with the illustration of Law 4. Data is crucial for AI to be trained, for models to be built. We need to ensure data continues to flow across borders, from one country to another, and also across the economy, right? And this is where I try to now tease out and identify how some of the things that we've done can and will now have to plug into global conversations. Data needs to move. And it is absolutely crucial that we engage in that conversation at proper forums to ensure that policymakers, companies understand it. Companies, I think, understand it keenly. Data is created where the factory is, where the consumer is, but data is processed and crunched where the expertise may sit. So it may be a different country. But more importantly, the decisions within a company is made where the decision makers come together. It could be a third country. For all that to happen, data must flow. And that's for planning. When you need to train models, you need to bring the data together again. You need to deliver a service. You need to do that as well. So that's one example of why we need to ensure that Singapore, right, is plugged into these conversations to ensure that this flow of data is preserved so that applications that we just talked about building can be built and can be used not just in Singapore but elsewhere. The second thing that is important about building AI applications is to recognize that the market is global. yes, there are some features that you want to localize. You might want to localize recommendations in your electronic, your on e-mall to different markets. But there are some features you need to make universal, like for example, detecting fraudulent actors on your network, right? Bad fraudsters who might be trying to scam. Some of these need to be done at a global scale to be more accurate. So again, businesses need to be able to have that choice to bring data together when necessary and to keep data localized when that makes sense. So again, building of applications, right, it has an impact as well. And for applications and our devices to work when we are on holiday at home, depending on whichever country we happen to be working in, standards are important. Standard settings are so important. And this is again one of those things that we again have to come together globally, right, to establish standards so that a company building an AI app in Singapore can sell it in many countries. So that when an IT professional or when you and I are trained to use a certain product, no matter where we go, we have different opportunities for employment. So again, that's crucial, right? And so it all comes back down to this, right? In a sense, we as a nation, individuals, companies, right, have benefited from this multilateralism, from the way the global order has been structured, where there are respect for rules, there are standard sets, right? Because it enables that flow of trade, flow of business, employment opportunities. And Singapore, I think, is one of those countries that is keenly aware of how important it is. So even in something as, you might think as parochial as AI, building applications, training, you cannot divorce that conversation from this conversation of being plugged into global networks. So just by saying that what we've done with our efforts in building a human-centric framework to approach development of AI and training and ensuring that consumers are prepared to use AI to build a virtuous group, we are now taking this conversation outside Singapore as well. We are hoping to link up research centers with our SMU center. We are taking our model framework and contributing it to the global discussions so that we can be part of the standard setting around good practices of data, model building, and monitoring of AI. And we hope that whatever work we've done in building up the consumer base, the seminars, the knowledge of our consumers and our workers in using and adopting AI, that methodology can also be shared, right, with like-minded associations engaged in this conversation as well. Because I think it's only when we do this, not only in the national but at the global level, that we can continue to enjoy those benefits I started my presentation with, right? The mobile phone, the app, right, works today, here, and tomorrow, wherever you happen to be, and whichever country you happen to be in.
Thank you very much, Seking. That was a very clear illustration of the concrete project. It's implemented at the national level on AI. This is a global issue to provide a human-centered approach of artificial intelligence that will be shared with the global community at the Paris Peace Forum. And before I open the questions to the audience, I would like to ask one question to Justin. Thinking about this very particular approach, this is the Paris Peace Forum is a sort of thematic multilateralism. We have the example of AI, You're tackling issues of environment, education, peace, development, and so on. How will you do to prevent that you are putting around the table stakeholders that they all agree with one another because they are tackling the same issues, instead of confronting stakeholders that will be in conflict instead?
Thanks. It really depends on the issue, and certainly most of the time you have the different actors on one side of the table and the problem on the other side of the table. So that's easy, because then the issue is not to agree among people who disagree with a certain distribution of power among them, etc., but rather how to cooperate to solve problems that are inherent to their activity. No, more generally, the question is, I think that we cannot, let's say, abstract ourselves or remove ourselves from the current political situation. And the current political situation is one in which populism has been, dominating not only the headlines, but the life of many countries in the West, in particular, and with echoes or different, let's say, variations from, some say from Brazil to the Philippines, closer to here, etc., and the different forms. So I don't want to put everything in the same bucket, in a sense. But the question is more, is there a risk? And that sort of ties in with the question that you were asking earlier, that is to say, a risk that we would only preach to the choir and discuss among converted people who are convinced that multilateral efforts by global elites is the best outcome that we can imagine. And so we are currently thinking about how we integrate these voices of dissent with one pointed question, which is, so many of these movements advocate basically, more sovereignty, more independence, and the relaxation of global rules, etc., and in order to promote their national interest more crudely, or their sort of more direct national interest, because of course national interest also encompasses fighting climate change and doing other things. So it's complicated. And so the question, the debate that we want to have with some of the leaders or thought leaders, from Steve Bannon to Orban in Hungary, to Salvini and others, is so how do you so since your objective is to represent the people and you want to defend the national interest, how do you intend to address these issues that are global in nature and that you cannot address by yourself without the help of these global institutions? And so, in other words, how do you fight climate? So a good example is fiscal evasion. So many populists and nationalists are saying we want our own tax rules and our own tax systems and etc. But of course, we want to be independent and sovereign on that because it's our rules. But the problem is, given the world we live in, where multinational companies, operate freely in most countries, and where capital can flow, there's no way you can regain your fiscal sovereignty without cooperation with the others, and so without institutions like the OECD, for example, that has been setting rules, without the efforts of the G20 to fight against money laundering and fiscal paradise, etc. So the question that we want to have and that we will have at the forum is, so how do you, we understand and we hear the quest for more sovereignty, for more direct accountability and democracy by these leaders, but how do they intend to remedy the problems that are global in nature and that for which they will need cooperation? Is it a series of bilateral decisions? Is it by ignoring the problem? I mean, the Trump administration and climate change is largely about saying that there is no man-made climate change. Is it by, having some kind of other type of cooperation? That's the question we want to have, and also demonstrate, and also a discussion with what I was alluding to earlier, that is to say, what should be the repartition of efforts in terms of fighting climate change, for example, among countries and also within countries, because the question of the social sustainability climate efforts is one that is very, very present in many countries, including in France, of course, with the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vest. You've been following that, I'm sure. And so that's also one question we want to integrate in the discussion of the forum. So here we're less project-based, but it's an important question, and so we'll be dealing with it this year.
My name's Ian Scott. Aren't you wasting your time talking to all these old people? It's really a question of demographics. And Danny, I very much appreciated what you said. But if you look at Brexit and look at many of these other issues, demographics are running in our favour very strongly. So I wouldn't waste my time talking to Steve Bannon, Trump, or any of these people. I would find ways to communicate to the younger people, because the Generation Z group, I believe Z, is it Z or Z? I can't remember. But communicate directly with these people. That's where the future is. Not with these old reactionary people who are living in a world that they can't recreate. We can't go back. There's only one way, there's only one gear, and that's forward.
Yes.
I want to follow up on this. I just want to thank Sciences Po. I'm graduated from Sciences Po 3 days ago, so it sort of persecutes. And I arrived from Paris yesterday. I have two little things. So the first one has to do with the challenge that populism poses to multilateralism. And we, the global elite, as it were, convinced ourselves that the problem is the left behind. The old people, not necessarily true, because in Poland, it's young people who vote for populist parties. So it's older people that vote for more moderate parties. So that doesn't hold necessarily true for every country. And then we've told ourselves it has to do with the poor and the old miners up in the northeast of England that somehow voted for Brexit, forgetting that Brexit wouldn't have won without the upper middle classes of the southeast, that in Brazil, it's upper class populism that is winning the day, not working class populism. So, can we have a more complex understanding of where populism is coming from? And then the second and very short question would be, this initiative, the Paris Peace Forum, is, of course, great because it's constructive, and especially the presence of non-state actors is very important. But again, the question remains is how do you implicate the demos, the people, in your discussions? I find that a very hard challenge to think about.
Hi, I'm Rationale. I'm a journalist and I occasionally teach public speaking at the university as well as an adjunct. So my question is on climate change, and I asked this question on the back of the Maldivian president's recent visit to Singapore, where we saw greater collaboration and collective action between Singapore and the Maldives on climate change. So my very broad question to you is, what do you see the challenges being in terms of greater collective action on the issue of climate change at your forum?
Maybe last question, yes.
Thank you. My name is B. I run a investment fund. I had a question. You talked a lot about global challenges, climate change, migration, etc., which undoubtedly we need a multilateral approach to. But on just one challenge, the income inequality, isn't that one more suited to a unilateral approach? We think about things now that apply, equity versus efficiency, the classic economics approach. Globalization has definitely increased the pie, but how it's been distributed obviously has been very unequal. And more globalization isn't really going to fix that. Do we really need a unilateral approach on that? And is it up to policymakers to find distributive measures to improve the standards and equality within countries?
If I might pick up on the demographic question first from the original two interventions. I lived in Britain right up until Brexit vote, the original Brexit vote, and so 3 years ago. And of course, I think, I have many friends who look on me as one of the London, estranged from the rest of the country. But many of these friends were people who were just ordinary English people. They read the Sun newspaper. They were house builders, electricity contractors. They worked with their hands. They were bricklayers, and I came to understand some of the frustrations that they had. I got to know them because I fought them. I sparred with them in martial arts. And after you fight someone, you have an understanding of one another that goes beyond simply trying to just have conversations. You really do feel that you try and understand what the other person wants. So on this front, I agree with you that the situation is actually complicated because in some nations, on the Brexit choice, for instance, the young people, the Londoners, all wanted to remain. But the older people who felt that their culture was being undermined wanted to Brexit. And as a number of examples that you've given tell us that as we look across the world, the sort of nationalist, populist extremists vary in complexity. So all that tells me is that we should not fall into easy stereotypes. We should treat each case on its own merit, and we should have a conversation that tries to understand the underlying forces. And the underlying forces are indeed explicable. They are uniform. They have to do with market competition. They have to do with social protection. They have to do with skills and training and gearing oneself up for a changing world. And I think that it is by focusing on those positive, constructive things that we can tell a good story, whether we're telling the story across nation states or within them. So this is also reflecting on the unilateral approaches to income inequality. Simply as a matter of fact, the rich end up squirreling their wealth in parts of the world that tax jurisdictions don't get to. This is a huge part of income inequality. It is not just what happens within a country, but it's an international compact that needs to understand the fiscal framework for how tax evasion occurs. There's an important part of income inequality. In that case, I don't want to belabor the point. The idea is that we actually do have a good story that attempts to take into account how differences across societies, differences across nations need to be taken into account. That does leave the big problem of how you come to an agreement in an international forum if some nation states begin to see these forums as zero-sum games. If America continues to portray the line that what India gains or what Mexico gains come only as its loss, how does a body like Paris Peace Forum negotiate the careful intersection or commonality of interest? I think there are ways, but it calls for us to be creative in how we approach these things.
Thanks. I couldn't agree more. That is to say, I think one of the generally the forum is universal, but of course, sometimes the local is a good way to understand the universal, or at least the resemblance between the local and many other situations abroad. And here, for the question of how to implicate the demos, I will take the example of the yellow vests. And the Gilets jaunes, because what's interesting is that not only it started, as you know, as a insurgency against the fuel tax, so it was a climate policy that rested in no small part on the shoulders of those rural populations that needed their cars and their diesel cars in particular to move around because they don't have access to public transportation, and also public services have gone further and further away from them, being concentrated in cities mostly. So they've been sort of they've had a double punition here, and of course that sort of pit, as we say, the question of the end of the month against the end of the world. That is to say, the social sustainability with the environmental sustainability. So the first thing is, and that's how we intend to implicate them, is to have a debate and try to discuss and see what the priorities should be, and how more importantly, the public policies should be devised so that they are not disproportionately falling on the shoulders of one specific group. The second thing is also to find commonality. And here I will follow on your footsteps because one thing that really popped up in all the Facebook exchanges, posts of the Yellow Vest, and the Yellow Vest were pretty much a Facebook phenomenon, was fiscal evasion. And that's something that sort of links the sort of global NGO community of mostly urban, public transportation and bicycle crowd with the more rural, lower classes or lower middle class people with their diesel cars, etc. It's the issue of fiscal justice and the fight against, money laundering and fiscal paradise, etc. And so we've not started yet. We've identified the interlocutors, and it's precisely by trying to find this common ground of worry that I think you can slowly bring them to a discussion in which they see the interest of global governance, which is precisely to fight for their very direct interest by using these global stuff that they generally don't like and think that they are the construct of selfish elites. And more generally, it's in trying to hold discussions on the commons. So that might seem remote from the end of the month, but the question of space, cyberspace, Arctic, Antarctica, oceans, all the commons that we know are necessary for many human activities and indeed sometimes life on Earth, to try to get the discussion to move. In other words. It's not because you have emergencies that you cannot sort of prioritize the greater danger, and you have to do both things, and that's the discussion we'd like to have with them. On the question of climate cooperation, so a good example is the idea that so one thing we're trying to promote is an Indian project that we're in discussion with because they're interested in coming to the forum and perhaps launching the initiative there. It's done by the National Disaster Management Agency in India, in Delhi, and what they have started building is an international coalition for resilient infrastructure. And that's a really interesting example of, first, of a pretty much South cooperation, and also a cooperation with other actors like investment banks, development agencies, foundations, etc. And what it is starting from the premise that 50% of the infrastructure that will exist in 2050 has not been built yet and will be built in the next 3 decades. They will be built in condition of duress, in condition of climate change, with drought, extreme weather, and other in a more hostile environment than now. And so the idea that the Indians had was to have a platform to share knowledge, good practices, pieces of regulation, etc., in order to improve the quality of infrastructure and have weather resilient and disaster resilient infrastructure. And so that's a good example of how the Paris Peace Forum can help bring that. So instead of them having to go see the development banks and the states, etc., they have a sort of one-stop shopping of potential partners and perhaps others that they have not even thought about at the Paris Peace Forum. And that's how we foster very concrete initiatives in adaptation to climate change or sometimes mitigation. There are other projects that I could talk about. And lastly, on income inequality, what we have is a number. So we have one village which is devoted to what we call inclusive economy, and that's a major issue. And here again, there are a couple of initiatives that are interesting, including the Business for Inclusive Growth, which is an OECD plus about 40 large corporations around the world that have committed to a certain number of measures, of social measures, to sort of mitigate inequalities, if not eliminate them. And other than that, you can find it on the website. But so we have a series of measures. Whether they are sufficient, I don't know, but at least they go in the right direction, and that's already something.
So please help me giving our speakers a round of applause.